The digital world, for men like me, is usually defined by systemic entropy. Every day, the signal decays, smothered beneath layers of bureaucratic sediment, corporate noise, and deliberate obfuscation. My specialty, honed over 2 decades operating in the shadows of the intelligence community, was filtering that noise, separating the ghost chatter from the genuine scream. Now, I am the Archivist, a self-imposed title for a man who chose anonymity over a state funeral, residing in a climate-controlled shell of an apartment overlooking a city I never bothered to learn the name of. My work is simple: analyze data streams too dangerous or inconvenient for official channels, ensuring certain truths, however ugly, survive deletion. The monotony was a shield, a necessary sedative after years of living on the knife edge of global instability. My office was less an office and more a crypt, soundproofed and Faraday-caged, lit only by the cold blue glow of 7 synchronized monitors. Then the package arrived. It was delivered not by a courier, but materialized through a series of anonymous drops orchestrated with a precision that chilled me far more than any direct threat. Inside the final, unmarked locker was a single, non-volatile solid-state drive, vacuum-sealed and protected by layers of military-grade cryptographic shielding. There was no sender address, no message, only a single, typed label attached to the drive casing: Project Chronos Dossiers. My immediate professional assessment was high-effort discard. A sophisticated piece of misdirection, perhaps a honey trap designed to consume my cycles with meaningless pursuit. In my experience, anything labeled with such a dramatically suggestive title was usually the opposite of what it claimed to be: empty theater meant to distract from the quiet, boring horrors. I prepared to run a 0-day deletion protocol, wiping the drive and consigning the package to the digital waste bin. But I paused. The encryption suite used was not standard issue. It was bespoke, complex, and layered in such a way that suggested not just protection from prying eyes, but a structural necessity. The sheer computational expense required to assemble this veil meant the payload was either vital or the obsession of a truly dedicated lunatic. State actors typically favor efficiency. This was Baroque security. Intrigued, I allocated a dedicated cluster of servers to the task, working around the clock to peel back the cryptographic onion. It took 48 hours of intense processing before the drive yielded. What emerged was not a single, coherent file, but a segmented archive, carefully catalogued and cross-referenced. 4 primary dossiers, each thousands of pages long, filled with schematics, transcribed audio logs, medical reports, and internal memoranda. They were meticulously organized under seemingly innocuous headers: Dossier I, Incident Reporting, Ashcroft Sanitation Survey ASS, Dossier II, Operational Review, Everbrook Biological Facility EBF, Dossier III, Administrative Audit, Blackwood Hills Trust, BHT, Dossier IV, Ecological Impact Study, Northern Coastal Zone, NCZ. The language was dry, stilted, and suffocatingly bureaucratic, the perfect camouflage. Everything was quantified, measured, and minimized. But as I began the initial phase of data mining, running filters for lexical anomalies and semantic repetition, the patterns began to surface, rising like scum on stagnant water. The first hint was the recurring cast of characters, or rather, the recurring absence of characters. Names appeared in Dossier I, Ashcroft, as victims of methane poisoning and then, startlingly, reappeared in Dossier III, Blackwood Hills, months later, either as low-level security contractors or as administrative transfers. People who were officially dead or missing were functionally relocated within this strange, interconnected archive. The geographic links were even more pronounced. Ashcroft, Everbrook, and Blackwood Hills were geographically disparate regions, separated by hundreds of miles, yet they formed the consistent backdrop for all 4 documented incident streams. Ashcroft was always associated with subterranean infrastructure and seismic tremors coded as fault line slippage. Everbrook always involved localized meteorological events and peculiar biological degradation categorized as aggressive fungal bloom. Blackwood Hills was consistently linked to secretive, high-net-worth individuals and organizations labeled as philanthropic initiatives. My skepticism began to crumble. This wasn't sophisticated disinformation. This was a library, a shadow registry of events deemed too dangerous to acknowledge, hidden in plain sight within the thick paper curtain of state negligence. I shifted my analysis from standard counterintelligence profiling to deep semantic decoding. I started isolating the technical jargon used to describe the effects of the incidents. Localized structural instability in Ashcroft consistently correlated with abnormal tissue density in Everbrook reports. Administrative failure due to personnel exhaustion in Blackwood Hills was the bureaucratic shorthand for radical psychological collapse. And then I saw it. The true, terrifying key. In Dossier I, under an entry detailing the recovery of human remains from a collapsed sewer tunnel in Ashcroft, there was a tiny, parenthetical note in the margin of the Internal Affairs Review, almost certainly added by a low-level analyst before the final purge. Note. Subject displayed non-Euclidean trauma consistent with pre-industrial reports. Pre-industrial reports. That single phrase cracked the cryptographic veil completely. They weren't hiding state secrets or corporate malfeasance. They were hiding mythology. The system wasn't struggling to contain corruption. It was struggling to contain the existence of forces that rendered reality unstable. The Ashcroft Sanitation Survey was not about sewage lines. It was about something vast and hungry burrowing beneath the foundation of civilization. The Everbrook Biological Facility was not studying fungi. It was documenting the aftermath of dimensional tearing. The entire archive, Project Chronos, was a meticulous record of the world's quiet, continuous negotiation with the monstrous and the truly alien. I realized I was holding the keys to the entire infrastructure of global supernatural suppression. 4 distinct narratives, 4 horror stories disguised as audits, now lay before me. Ashcroft, the deep ground threat. Everbrook, the spatial and biological corruption. Blackwood Hills, the psychological and ethical decay. And the 4th, the debt, the chilling mechanism binding them all together. I leaned back in my chair, the chill of the monitors no match for the sudden, profound cold that permeated the room. I was no longer a retired analyst playing with ghost data. I was the keeper of the chronometers, and the clock was ticking backward. I highlighted the introductory page of the first full report. Dossier I, The Catacombs of Ashcroft. Subject, Elias Vance, Municipal Tunnel Engineer, Incident Code, Chronos A4, Classification, Methane Leaks/Industrial Fatality. The archivist began to read. Dossier I was the first to surface fully intact from the scrambled mass, and it was titled with the bureaucratic blandness characteristic of deep cover operations. Ashcroft Drainage Remediation, Q3-05. The initial data dump suggested nothing more than a severe civil engineering failure. But beneath the layers of standardized reports and falsified meter readings lay the testimony of Elias Vance, a man whose life had been measured in meters of brickwork and gallons of sluggish black water. He was the archivist's keyhole into the earth. Elias Vance had been an Ashcroft tunnel rat for 30 years. He knew the undercity like the lines on his palm, the cool, structured predictability of the original Victorian brick conduits, the predictable rhythm of the water flow, the predictable stench of rot and waste. But 3 months before the remediation report, the predictability had vanished. It was replaced by a dull, persistent vibration that had nothing to do with the city traffic above. It was a pulse, slow and impossibly heavy, coming from depths Ashcroft's architects had never intended to breach. Elias found the source and bypassed Sector 9 Alpha, an area designated for non-critical overflow, now riddled with fresh, aggressively bored tunnels. These weren't the graceful curves of modern tunneling. They were crude, jagged boreholes, tearing right through load-bearing strata. The air down there was wrong. The usual acidic tang of sewage was overwhelmed by something mineral, metallic, and profoundly cold, the smell of ancient, disturbed clay and raw iron ore, spiked with concentrations of CO gas that made his head swim even through the filtered mask. His team had refused to follow him past the 7th manhole. They sensed the wrongness viscerally. Elias, driven by a professional loyalty to the infrastructure he served, went on alone, his helmet lamp cutting a weak, desperate cone through the subterranean gloom. He moved through a fissure that felt less like a tunnel and more like an open wound in the planet's crust. The vibration intensified as he descended, moving from a subtle tremor to a bodily thrumming that resonated in his chest cavity. It was not mechanical, it had an organic rhythm, like a slow, gigantic heartbeat. Then came the sound that cut through the thick, oppressive silence, scraping. Not the sound of machinery, but the wet, massive abrasion of limestone against something chitinous and dense. It sounded like the earth being clawed open by an entity that existed solely to tunnel. Elias crouched near a newly breached junction pipe. The concrete reinforcement, engineered to withstand centuries of pressure, was not cracked, but sheared. Along the shear line, the material had been pulverized into a fine, crystalline dust, and embedded in the remaining concrete were deep, gouging tracks. They weren't the marks of a drill head, they were the impressions of colossal talons, sensitive to the minute fluctuations of the rock face. He understood then that this wasn't an engineering failure. It was an occupation. They had opened a door, and whatever had come through was still down there, expanding its territory, feeding on the darkness, and growing monstrously large. He tracked the scraping sound deeper into the tunnels of 9 Alpha, where the light seemed to surrender instantly to the blackness. The air temperature dropped suddenly, plunging into a freezing dampness that had nothing to do with groundwater. The CO alarm on his wrist unit shrieked a warning, but Elias barely heard it over the booming pulse. He realized the creature, whatever it was highly sensitive to vibration and atmospheric chemistry. The rising CO was perhaps a byproduct of its massive metabolism, or perhaps a deliberate tactic to incapacitate prey. Then, the scraping stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound, a vacuum of anticipation. Elias froze, his lamp beam fixed on the end of the tunnel, which shimmered slightly, distorted by the rising heat and poisonous gas. He tasted the air, thick clay, ozone, and a sickeningly sweet scent of fresh, hot blood mixed with something sulfuric, the breath of the chthonic maw. The maw was not a single point of presence, but a colossal, undulating mass. Elias felt it before he saw any discernible shape. The floor vibrated violently, sending dust scattering, and the walls groaned as they were subjected to immediate, incomprehensible pressure. He sensed the sheer size of the thing, its movements heavy and deliberate, a mountainous creature of the deep earth sensing the fragile presence of surface life. It was a nightmare-given substance, a hunger that defined the darkness. A section of the tunnel wall, previously solid, suddenly dissolved inward with a noise like 1,000 grinding stones. Elias instinctively shielded his face. He saw only a glimpse of what appeared to be layered, petroleum-black hide, slick and glistening, and the sudden appearance of appendages that moved too fast to track, leaving profound grooves in the rock. The maw was tasting the air, using the vibrations in the tunnel floor as a sensitive palate. Elias knew he couldn't run. The maw was faster, stronger, and intimately familiar with the labyrinthine geography. He had seconds. He fumbled in his utility pouch, pulling out 2 things: the small, tightly packed explosive charge meant for controlled demolition of old piping, and a half-smoked cigarette he'd saved for his break. His hands were shaking, not just from the fear, but from the CO poisoning that was already blurring his vision. He affixed the charge to the exposed lip of the tunnel opening. He had to overload the maw's sensory apparatus, to strike at its foundation of darkness and pressure. But he couldn't use the standard electrical detonator. It might fail in the extreme dampness, and the sound would alert the creature prematurely. With a gasp for the thin, toxic air, Elias pulled the charge's safety fuse, measured it against the length of his index finger, just enough time, and then, with the last steady movement he could muster, he took the cigarette, lit it with his heavy-duty lighter, and pressed the burning end against the dark green fuse wire. He turned and ran, navigating the treacherous, slick path back toward the manhole, counting the heavy, rhythmic thumps of the maw's proximity. Each thump was a colossal footstep drawing nearer. He didn't look back. He ran on adrenaline and the realization that the maw's expansion wasn't accidental. The tunneling project had been a deliberate breach, a calculated act of warfare that released something elemental into the veins of Ashcroft. The blast was not just an explosion, it was the concentrated, poisonous discharge of compressed methane and sulfurous vapor directed back into the maw's immediate habitat. The sound was a concussive roar that shattered his eardrums and threw him violently against the mossy Victorian brickwork. The light of the subsequent combustion lasted only a moment, but in that flash, Elias saw the dense, collapsing tunnel mouth, sealing the passage and burying the maw, at least temporarily, under thousands of tons of unstable earth. When the dust settled and the agonizing ringing in his ears began to fade, Elias crawled out, choking on the acrid smoke. He had survived, but he knew the truth that the official report, the one claiming an industrial gas leak exacerbated by structural fatigue, was designed to conceal. He had been a combatant in a war he never signed up for, a subterranean specialist force to detonate spiritual gunpowder against a creature that should only exist in the nightmares of geologists. He carried the scars, the broken ribs, and the knowledge that the pulse, that slow, earth-shattering thump of the chthonic maw, was merely dormant, waiting for the tectonic pressure to build again. Arthur Finch had always found comfort in the quantifiable. He could handle the threat of structural collapse, the stress calculations of a failing load-bearing wall, or even the grim finality of a methane pocket explosion. These were dangers with rules, risks that could be mitigated, and numbers that eventually balanced. But nothing in his extensive career as a certified integrity specialist had prepared him for the sterile, soul-crushing dread of Sublevel 12, the place the personnel informally called the Ivory Cage. The cage was Ashcroft Sector 7, a subterranean facility bored deep into the bedrock beneath the industrial district. Unlike the humid, organic terror rumored to exist in the lower catacombs, this environment was surgical. Titanium doors thick as bank vaults, air that tasted of recycled purity and burnt copper, and lighting so aggressively white it felt judgmental. Arthur was here to assess the anomalous harmonic oscillation, a bureaucratic euphemism for the facility's violent, unexplained shuddering that had ceased only after the emergency lockdown seal had been triggered 3 days prior. He led a small tech-fit security team, their boots echoing flatly on the reinforced polymer floors. The silence, broken only by the low, insistent drone of the reserve power grid, was profoundly unnatural. It suggested a vacuum, a space where life had not merely left, but had been violently extracted. "Environmental readings are stable, sir," reported Lieutenant Reyes, the lead security officer, her voice tightly modulated over the internal comms. "But the pressure differential is fluctuating near the central junction. It's breathing, almost." Arthur ignored the poetic description. "Reyes, check the integrity of the containment hatch seals on sectors A and C. I need to know if we are dealing with a leak or a breach." As they moved deeper, the temperature plummeted, forcing tiny puffs of vapor from their labored breathing, despite the sealed environment suits. The air, once tasting of antiseptic, began to carry a new note, not the earthy funk of sewage or methane, but something sharp, like crushed glass and ozone. It was the smell of broken dimensions. They reached the main observation deck overlooking the primary testing chamber, a cylinder of impenetrable ceramic and reinforced glass. Or at least, it had been impenetrable. Now, the glass facing was crazed, not cracked by impact, but warped by immense, internal pressure, resembling a web of calcified screams. Arthur pressed his visor against the glass, trying to penetrate the gloom inside. It was then he heard it, a sound that defied physics. It wasn't scratching or dragging, it was the sound of metal being torn, not by force, but by a process, a relentless, slow shearing, like 1,000 dull knives working on a single sheet of tin foil. "Shut down the active noise suppression," Arthur commanded, needing clarity, needing the raw horror. When the humming died, the room filled with the sickening chorus, the grinding, the tearing, and a wet, rhythmic thump hiss that seemed to originate from the center of the chamber. And then, a voice, a rasping, terrified whisper that cut through the noise pollution. "They're not fragments, Finch. They are the fragments. The failed architecture." The voice belonged to Dr. Elias Vance. Arthur spun around. The name hit him with a specific, chilling recognition. Elias Vance. The name had appeared, subtly coded, in the peripheral analysis of the Chronos Dossiers, attached to reports involving industrial sabotage near the old Ashcroft waterworks, reports that should have been sealed under an entirely different classification. The man standing before him was not the sewer worker of those reports, but a physicist, clad in a soiled lab coat, leaning against the useless console, his eyes radiating pure, intellectual despair. "Vance, what in God's name is happening here?" Arthur demanded, raising his specialized inspection lamp. Vance laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "We opened the door, Finch. We thought we could harvest the raw energy of non-existence, shape it, perfect it. We called it Project Ivory Cage because we thought we were containing the sublime. We were wrong. It's a cage for us." He pointed a trembling finger toward the dark testing chamber. "The shards. They are what happens when matter tries to accommodate pure entropy. They are our colleagues." As if summoned by the name, movement erupted inside the chamber. Not fluid movement, but angular, jagged, terrifyingly fast. The shards were horrific in their geometry. They were vaguely humanoid, but their forms were fundamentally broken. Skin, pale, tight, and stretched to the point of transparency, was ripped across sharp, bone-like extrusions that jutted out at impossible angles, elbows pointing inward, femurs piercing the stomach, ribs forming external cages. They moved with a lurching, precise gait, fueled by a relentless kinetic need. They were calcified agony given motion. The sound of metal tearing was the sound of them moving against their own hardened flesh. "Reyes! Full lockdown! We pulled back!" Arthur yelled, his scientific objectivity dissolving under the weight of existential terror. It was too late. One of the shards, faster than light should allow, slammed into the observation glass. The glass didn't shatter. It fractured into myriad tiny segments, each shard glowing with residual dimensional energy, a mosaic of inevitable failure. "They react to sound, but mostly to vibration," Vance whispered frantically, gripping Arthur's suit sleeve. "They are seeking stability. They need to integrate. And we are the closest complete forms." The containment door leading into the observation deck suddenly crumpled inward with a sound like a freight train collision. A second shard stood in the entryway, its head twisted backwards, revealing teeth that were not bone, but jagged, black ceramic. "Tech fit! Engage!" Reyes screamed, her team raising their plasma rifles. The battle was brief and futile. Plasma vaporized large swathes of the shard's external bone structure, but the damage seemed only to anger it, making its movements even more erratic and sharp. Reyes managed to put 2 full charges into its core mass before a jutting shoulder blade sheared through her helmet, silencing the comms with a sickening crunch. Vance, seeing the massacre, grabbed Arthur by the arm and shoved him towards a maintenance duct opening near the ceiling. "The emergency egress. You have to report this. Not the HO, but the debt. They take the stable life and pay the debt of their existence back in broken existence." Arthur scrambled into the tight duct, the screams of the remaining security team muffled by the metallic confines. He glanced back just as Vance, eyes alight with final, terrifying clarity, reached out and purposely slammed his hand onto a sparking electrical conduit. The resulting surge, a brilliant flare of blue light and ozone, momentarily stunned the shards, buying Arthur precious seconds. He crawled through the labyrinthine maintenance shafts, the echoing thump-hiss of the entities pursuing him below, the sound warping and distorting through the ventilation system, until it sounded like his own heartbeat, broken and jagged. He emerged 3 hours later, covered in grime, blood that wasn't his, and the persistent metallic tang of dimensional seepage, near the Level 1 decontamination zone. He hit the primary alarm sequence, collapsing as the external emergency teams rushed in. The debriefing lasted 72 hours. He detailed the facility's true purpose, the nature of the shards, the sacrifice of Reyes and Vance, and the complete failure of the dimensional stabilization theory. He spoke of calcified horror and the geometry of agony. The official response arrived 6 weeks later, filed away under Ashcroft Incident 7A45, Calibration Error. Arthur Finch was commended for his composure during the operational incident, granted 10 days paid stress leave, and promptly issued a formal administrative notice. The notice detailed the estimated cost of the destroyed titanium door seal, the unauthorized discharge of 3 government plasma rifles, and the resultant contamination of the maintenance shafts. His report on interdimensional incursions was filed, unread, beneath a cover sheet marked Structural Integrity Specialist Arthur Finch, failure to maintain fiscal protocol during minor equipment calibration error. The ivory cage was resealed, its horrific occupants left to their angular patrol, the whole affair neatly converted into a budgetary line item. Arthur Finch was back in the world of numbers, knowing that the greatest horror was not the monsters themselves, but the cold, calculating system that quantified their sacrifice. He still smelled the ozone and crushed glass every time he closed his eyes, a souvenir the bureaucracy couldn't take back, but could easily dismiss. The pain had become Julian Thorne's shadow, a companion so constant it dictated the rhythm of his breathing and the angle of his spine. It was a searing, relentless neurological fire, an invisible architecture of suffering that conventional medicine had long since surrendered to categorize. Julian, a low-level intelligence analyst with access to several sealed government networks, had exhausted every legitimate avenue for relief. He was a man defined by his limitations, a prisoner within his own failing chassis. It was this desperation that made him vulnerable to Rain Calloway. Rain was not a doctor, but an architect of opportunity, a woman whose eyes held the cold, polished shine of deep conviction. She met Julian in the private gallery of the Ashcroft Museum, surrounded by classical sculptures that epitomized impossible physical perfection. She spoke of optimization, of unlocking the true framework of the body, whispering that some wounds were not biological flaws but evidence of a poorly negotiated contract with existence itself. She didn't offer a cure, she offered a renegotiation. The path led him to an unmarked penthouse overlooking the Blackwood Hills financial district, the domain of Mr. Silas Garland. Garland, who preferred the moniker the Curator, was immaculately tailored, possessing a skin that appeared to absorb light rather than reflect it, suggesting a deep, unnatural state of preservation. His office felt less like a workspace and more like a mausoleum dedicated to forgotten secrets. Garland listened patiently to Julian's recitation of symptoms, his head tilted like a collector inspecting a chipped artifact. "We do not deal in temporary fixes, Mr. Thorne," Garland said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly against the inner eardrum. "We offer completion. But perfection carries a price far steeper than currency." The Faustian bargain was laid bare. Julian's debt was not money, but classified information. Specifically, the data streams he could siphon concerning anomalous energy fluctuations, covert disaster response protocols, and most critically, the internal memoranda surrounding certain geographically quarantined zones, Ashcroft, Everbrook, and the Everbrook protocol logs. This information, often veiled in bureaucratic jargon about administrative failure or seismic activity, was exactly what Garland sought. Julian, consumed by the promise of silence from the internal screaming of his nerves, agreed instantly. The exchange was formalized not with a handshake, but with a simple, chilling instruction. Garland merely placed a single, cool hand on Julian's forehead. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. It was not healing, it was erasure. The constant fire in Julian's spine evaporated, replaced by a crystalline clarity. He felt his blood flow with perfect efficiency, his muscles responding with a clean, effortless power he had never known. The world snapped into sharp focus, the dull haze of chronic pain lifted, revealing textures and sounds with terrifying precision. He was not just well, he was optimized. He was a vessel of kinetic perfection, and the intoxicating rush of this newfound sovereignty swiftly eclipsed any moral qualms about the data he was illicitly feeding to Garland's encrypted servers. He became fiercely loyal, viewing Garland not as a collector of secrets, but as a benefactor who had restored his very right to existence. For months, Julian operated in a state of euphoric servitude, delivering dossiers, reports on seismic anomalies, the chthonic maw, and failed dimensional containment protocols, Project Ivory Cage, to the Curator. The debt felt trivial compared to the gift. Then, he was invited to witness a disciplinary session, a requirement, Garland explained coolly, for maintaining perspective within the society of the grotesque, the true name of their inner circle. The chamber was located deep beneath the penthouse, a space rendered sterile by white tile and overwhelming fluorescent light. Waiting there was a man Julian vaguely recognized, a former society member who had apparently grown hesitant about continuing his contributions. Garland did not raise his voice or employ physical restraint. He merely stood before the man and gestured dismissively. The perfection dissolved. It did not retreat slowly, it buckled violently. Julian watched, horrified, as the man's revitalized flesh began to invert. The skin, once smooth and resilient, tightened and tore, not from external pressure but from internal reconfiguration. His bones thickened and warped, cracking through the taut skin of his back and shoulders, transforming into protruding, jagged white spurs. His face collapsed inwards, the carefully repaired facial structure dissolving into a mask of gray, weeping tissue. The man's screams were the worst part. They were screams of ultimate betrayal, of a pain that Julian recognized instantly, amplified 1,000-fold. This was not the return of the old malady. This was the weaponization of the body's own healing mechanisms, turning them against the host. This transformation, Garland explained later, produced the grotesque, the physical manifestation of a debt unpaid. They were kept, not as prisoners, but as monuments to the consequences of moral cowardice, their suffering maintained in a perpetual, maximized state. They were living, breathing examples of the amplified pain that awaited those who dared to breach the agreement. Julian, shivering despite his perfect health, pushed the horror down and continued his work, terrified of sharing that fate. But the data inevitably ran dry. The Project Chronos archives, though vast, were finite. One afternoon, Julian presented a batch of increasingly thin reports, mostly administrative filler concerning minor logistical errors at Everbrook. Garland didn't need to read them. He looked up, his flawless features impassive. "The currency, Mr. Thorne, requires constant liquidity," he observed mildly. "A trickle is not a payment. It is merely a delay." A sudden, sharp shock of agony seized Julian's left arm. It felt as though every nerve fiber was being frayed by microscopic razor wire. He gasped, dropping the files, and stumbled back. "The system requires balance," Garland continued, rising slowly. "You were optimized. Now you are recalibrated." The pain intensified, spreading like wildfire across his torso. It was the same chronic fire, but the volume had been turned up past endurance. Julian collapsed onto the polished marble floor, convulsing, weeping, grasping at the skin that now felt like a cage of burning glass. Garland had not restored his previous state. He had used the perfected neurological pathways to channel an unbearable intensity of suffering. Julian barely escaped, crawling out of the penthouse complex and into the anonymous sprawl of the city. He abandoned his job, his apartment, and his identity. He became a terrified ghost, forever hunted not by Garland's operatives, but by the memory of perfection and the omnipresent, amplified suffering that now defined his every second. He knew that the grotesque were still down there, their twisted forms a constant, horrifying reminder. But what terrified him most was the realization that he was no longer a victim of disease, he was a monument of failed commerce. The pain was his penance, and every searing nerve impulse whispered the same, final truth. He was merely waiting for the Curator to collect the last, most agonizing installment of his debt. The perfection had been temporary, the grotesque suffering was eternal. Dossier IV, designated Everbrook, arrived in the system as a geological survey anomaly, a highly improbable pattern of localized decay clustered around the defunct logging settlement. Yet, the accompanying field notes, handwritten and tucked into the encrypted metadata, spoke of nothing so mundane as tectonic stress or acidic soil. They spoke of stillness, of a profound and unnatural quiet that swallowed sound and light, and of a man named Marcus Bellwether. Everbrook was a town defined by the persistent, iron-gray fog that never lifted, clinging to the dilapidated Victorian facades and leaching the color from the surrounding Blackwood forests. In Everbrook, death was not feared, it was an expectation, a gradual diminishment accepted by the community with the passive resignation of livestock awaiting slaughter. They understood the price of living there, though they rarely spoke the details aloud. They understood the necessity of small, frequent losses. Marcus Bellwether had survived the unthinkable, the great stillness of '89, when the fog had thickened for 3 days, and when it finally thinned, half the town's population simply ceased to exist. They hadn't died of illness or accident. They had simply vanished, leaving behind cool spots on the bedding and unturned pages in books. Marcus was the only one who emerged from that event without a scratch, his skin unnaturally vibrant, his breathing deep and robust. The town looked at him then, not with envy, but with terror. He had cheated the toll, and the toll collector was coming for his collateral. The aftermath was subtle at first. Marcus noticed the potted fern on his windowsill, a tough variety that had survived decades, withered and brown within hours of him touching the soil. The milk soured instantly upon being poured into his cup. Then came the biological drain. His wife, Clara, once a woman of hearty laughter, grew thin and pale. Her energy didn't ebb, it was actively siphoned. When she slept near him, she would wake exhausted, marked by dark, hollow circles beneath her eyes, as if her dreams had been filled with rigorous, unending labor. His sons stopped growing. The life force was flowing out of their household, drawn relentlessly toward the epicenter of the anomaly, Marcus himself. He tried to leave. He loaded the family truck, but the engine died 3 miles out of town, the battery suddenly inert, the fuel seeming to decompose in the tank. Everbrook, he realized, wasn't a place he lived. It was a structure he was now integral to, a piece of the mechanism. The pact had claimed him. He was a vessel, or perhaps, a permanent siphon. As Clara's voice became a rasp and his son's eyes grew vacant, Marcus knew he had to confront the source of the system. He sought the counsel of those who still held the old knowledge, the keepers of the town's debt. This led him deep into the fog, past the abandoned mills, toward the standing stones known only as the Whispering Cairn, where the Oracle of the Mists resided. The Oracle was not a person but a collective of static, aged voices emanating from a deep, waterlogged fissure beneath the stones. The air here was thick with the scent of ozone and forgotten blood. When Marcus cried out his torment, confessing his terrible, life-stealing survival, the Oracle answered, its voice a chorus of dry, rustling leaves. You were not meant to endure the stillness, Bellwether. The ledger demanded balance. When the toll was collected, the total was found wanting. A large deficit remained. You are that deficit. Marcus fell to his knees, scraping them raw on the mossy granite. What is this debt? What did I take? The Oracle explained the nature of Everbrook, weaving a horrifying mythology that transcended simple curse. It was a thermodynamic equation, they hissed. All existence required fuel. Most of the world paid through entropy, through the slow, steady decay of time and regret. But certain places, certain thresholds, like Everbrook, had been designated as collection points to satisfy a greater, cosmic transaction. The pact ensures the continuous hum of reality. It requires specific payments. When you survived the stillness, you absorbed the payment of 23 souls. You did not merely live, you commandeered their remaining existence, their unspent potential, their future sorrows. You carry the debt of existence. The weight of 23 phantom lives crushed Marcus. He was a black hole, and the longer he persisted, the more immediate, tangible life he would consume to feed the energy he had stolen. Clara and his son were merely the closest sources of sustenance. He demanded a solution. The Oracle was ready. They produced a small, ancient vial carved from bone, stoppered with tar. Inside, a liquid moved like thick, oily shadow, pure essence, a solvent for the stolen life. The repayment must be total, Bellwether. You must return what you stole, willingly and painfully. The process will be agonizing, as the potential must be unwound from your very marrow. But upon its completion, the ledger will be cleared. Everbrook will breathe again. Marcus took the vial. The weight felt immense, a physical manifestation of his guilt and his terrible longevity. He walked back to his silent, dying home. Clara lay in bed, her breathing shallow, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, already halfway to that peaceful stillness. He kissed her papery forehead, tasting the metallic tang of imminent expiration. He apologized to his sleeping, emaciated son. Then, standing in the center of the room, feeling the terrible pull of the stolen life vibrating within his chest, he uncorked the vial. The liquid had no discernible scent, yet it carried the overwhelming implication of everything ending. It was cold, colder than ice, and when he forced himself to swallow the entire draught, the pain was instantaneous and absolute. It was not a burning or a freezing, it was an unmaking. He collapsed, convulsing as the borrowed time rebelled against being reclaimed. He felt the 23 souls he had inadvertently imprisoned fighting their way out, tearing through his muscle fibers, shredding the protective membrane of his own being. His unnaturally vibrant skin darkened, cracking like dry clay. He could hear the thrumming, vibrating energy being pulled out of him, a great, rushing wind that only he could perceive, carrying away the vitality he had unjustly held. The ordeal lasted only moments, yet it stretched into an eternity defined by the ripping apart of his selfhood. When it was over, Marcus lay still, broken, but exquisitely empty. The life was gone. The debt was paid. The change in the room was immediate and palpable. The shadow of depletion lifted. Clara, suddenly, deeply inhaled, a breath that sounded full and restorative. The dark circles around her eyes, though still present, softened. A faint, almost imperceptible warmth returned to the air in the room. Marcus Bellwether did not survive the repayment, but in his final, fading moments, before the stillness finally claimed him, he felt something he hadn't experienced since before the great stillness of '89, the quiet, gentle weight of a soul at peace. He had fulfilled his terrible purpose, restoring the necessary, terrifying balance of Everbrook. The dossier ended with a short administrative note, * localized environmental conditions normalized 48 hours post-incident. Debt cleared. Everbrook remains within tolerance parameters, *. The office was a tomb of glass and quiet efficiency, exactly the kind of sterile environment designed to make the messy realities of the world manageable, reducible to histograms and threat matrices. I preferred it that way. For years, as a senior intelligence data analyst, a glorified ghost, I had specialized in finding patterns in the noise, the whispers that major governments dismissed as statistical anomalies. They called me the Archivist, because I didn't just store data, I categorized the silences. I'd seen the ugly seams of reality frayed before, but always from a safe, digital distance. That distance evaporated the day the package arrived. It wasn't physical, it materialized in my encrypted drive bay via a ghost protocol I didn't recognize, bypassing 7 layers of proprietary security. The file was labeled with the cryptic, amateurish title, Project Chronos Dossiers. I initially tagged it for deletion, classifying it as high-grade intelligence litter, the kind of carefully constructed deep-state fan fiction designed to clog up analysis pipelines. The compression artifacts were too clean, the encryption too elegant. Real paranoia is sloppy. But then I ran a hash check cross-referencing the file structure against known government signatures, and nothing matched. It was an orphan. Curiosity, the analyst's professional curse, nudged me. I spent 48 hours peeling back the layers of bespoke encryption, revealing not high-level diplomatic secrets or defense schematics, but raw, unfiltered incident reports, thousands of pages masquerading as mundane failures. They were coded flawlessly. A structural integrity failure was a breach. A localized atmospheric anomaly was a spatial distortion. A civil administration misalignment was mass hysteria caused by something unseen. What compelled me, what anchored the trash data into something terrifyingly real, was the recursive nature of the key metadata. 3 names, almost religiously repeated, acted as nodal points: Ashcroft, Everbrook, and Blackwood Hills. These weren't adjacent towns, they were geographically disparate zones linked only by a single, specialized, and highly classified infrastructure project that had been officially cancelled a decade prior. I knew that project. It was the aborted attempt to unify localized deep Earth energy grids, a financial black hole that vanished from public record. The dossiers painted a different picture. They weren't records of construction failure. They were records of containment failure. They documented the true operational costs of the things that lived below the crust and beyond the veil. The archivist had stopped analyzing noise and had started analyzing screams. The air in my sterile office, which had always smelled faintly of ozone and recycled paper, suddenly felt heavy, saturated with the metallic scent of damp earth and something far older than civilization. The first dossier demanded my attention. It was the root, the origin point of the contagion, Ashcroft. The report, initially filed as a routine assessment of non-standard erosion patterns in the Ashcroft municipal water system, focused entirely on the observations of Elias Vance, a third-generation caving expert and municipal drainage specialist. Vance was the quintessential man of the earth, intimately familiar with every cold, curved brick of the original Victorian sewer system and every meter of the newer, cheap concrete piping. He knew the difference between the sound of dripping water and the sound of settling foundations. The incident report began innocuously enough, detailing a scheduled inspection in the oldest, deepest sector, the labyrinth beneath Ashcroft that still retained the geometry of 19th-century occult architecture, narrow and deeply resonant. Vance described the initial descent not with fear, but with professional frustration. The humidity was wrong, too thick, too warm for the depth, carrying the sharp, dizzying scent of clay, ozone, and something else, a raw, sulfuric tang that hinted at disturbed geological strata far deeper than the main drain. His lamp, a sturdy halogen rig designed to cut through steam and darkness, seemed to absorb the light rather than project it. The shadows in the Ashcroft depths were not merely the absence of light. They felt like a physical presence, a viscous layer clinging to the arched ceilings. It was the rhythm that broke his composure. Not random noise, but a pattern. A low, heavy thump-thump followed by a wet, scraping shhhhk. It wasn't the sound of heavy machinery or seismic activity. It was organic, deliberate, and vast. Vance had initially filed the sounds under water hammer resonance, but as he moved deeper toward the designated inspection site, a junction where the old brick met the new, deeply bored tunnel segments, the resonance intensified. It vibrated not just in the air, but through the soles of his rubber boots and into the marrow of his bones. He checked his seismic monitor. Nothing registered above a faint tremor, yet his body felt like a tuning fork vibrating on a subsonic frequency. The inspection site itself was a nightmare of engineering malpractice. The new tunnel, meant for a high-capacity rainwater overflow, had not been bored cleanly. It looked gnawed. Huge, irregular gouges, wider than a man, scarred the ferro-concrete. He ran his glove across the marks. The material wasn't pulverized. It was scraped, pulverized, and fused slightly at the edges, as if subjected to immense pressure and instantaneous, localized heat, a friction that defied conventional physics. This was not erosion, this was feeding. Vance radioed his surface crew, reporting a structural anomaly and demanding immediate withdrawal. But as he turned to retreat, the entrance tunnel sealed itself. Not structurally collapsed, but occluded. A thick, gelatinous substance, the color of wet peat and shimmering with phosphorescent bacteria, rapidly extruded from the ceiling seams and filled the exit point. The air immediately became thinner, heavy with carbon monoxide and that terrible, metallic scent. He was trapped. This was when he truly met the chthonic maw. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the pounding. Vance killed his primary light, relying only on the faint, nervous beam of his helmet lamp. He understood darkness, but this was a superior form of blackness and awareness. He realized the maw wasn't a single beast, but a manifestation of the subterranean network itself, a vast, hungry consciousness that used the tunnels as its digestive tract. The maw responded to pressure, to vibration, and most terrifyingly to fear. In the ensuing struggle, meticulously documented in Vance's truncated log entries, he described the sensation of the floor subtly shifting beneath him, not a cave-in, but a peristaltic movement, the tunnel walls pressing inward. He heard the sound of claws, immense and thick, clicking on the brickwork just out of sight. The size estimate was impossible. He calculated the source of the vibration to be something weighing dozens of tons, moving with the deceptive speed of an earthworm through soil. He felt the exhalation, a hot, fetid blast of methane and primordial rot that caused the exposed skin on his neck to blister instantly. Vance was a pragmatic man, not prone to panic, but he understood the physics of his demise. He was being digested, slowly, by the Earth's own hidden hunger. The log entry stopped focusing on structural data and focused on survival instinct. He had two options: suffocate on the increasingly toxic air or be crushed/eaten by the omnipresent pressure. Then came the realization that turned the dossier from a horror story into an indictment. Vance wasn't just trapped, he was sacrificed. The tunnel he was sent to inspect was a known point of weakness, a deliberate breach. The construction logs indicated that the new segment had been intentionally lined with combustible resin and sealed against external ventilation, turning it into a gas chamber waiting for a spark. The mall was not interested in him. It was being baited with him. In his final, desperate entry, Elias Vance did the one thing that would contradict his entire professional life. He accepted the terror and offered a counter-tactic. He found the flare kit meant for signaling distress. He didn't use the flare. He used the emergency igniter, striking it against the damp brick. He didn't ignite the methane. He ignited the lining, the toxic resin meant to seal off the breach. The log ended abruptly. If they want this thing contained, they need to know it breathes this rot. Fire doesn't kill it. Fire just makes it hungry for their other entry points. Tell them. The report concluded with a bland assessment of incident outcome. A significant methane explosion, attributed to poor industrial safety standards, resulted in the loss of one life and the collapse of 300 meters of deep sewer line. Containment successful. Reading those final words, I felt a deep chill. Containment successful. The mall was real, biological, and it demanded specific, toxic sacrifices, choreographed by some entity above ground. This wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. I filed the report, noted the code, Chronos MAW01. The metallic taste of ash and burnt clay lingered in my mouth, even though I was miles away from Ashcroft. I needed a palate cleanser, and Dossier II, labeled Blackwood Hills, promised a shift in genre, moving from the stench of the grave to the sterile terror of the lab. The transition was jarring. From the damp, ancient horror of the sewers, I plunged into the hyper-clean, humming cold of an underground scientific installation, codenamed the Ivory Cage. This facility was registered officially as a geological research hub, but the contents of Dossier II, authored by security technician Arthur Finch, detailed something far more disturbing than rock samples. The fear Finch described wasn't the physical, primal dread of being consumed. It was the intellectual terror of knowing that the universe was fractured and that his job was to maintain the bars on the cage holding the jagged edges. Arthur Finch was a former SWAT operator, valuing discipline and predictable threat parameters. His early reports focused on standard procedural anxiety, guarding highly sensitive materials, the stifling security protocols, and the agonizing silence of the lower levels, HOA, High Operating Area. Finch initially feared the human threat, the rival nations, the corporate spies. He feared the cold steel and the electric current that ran through the double-locked blast doors. But the facility itself taught him a new, insidious fear. The Ivory Cage was dedicated to Phase 2 of the Project Chronos mandate, the study of extruded spatial anomalies, or ESAs. Finch was stationed in Sublevel 7, the deepest chamber, a massive, lead-lined cylinder buried beneath the Blackwood Hills granite shelf. His job was simple: monitor the pressure seals and ensure that nothing came through the primary research aperture, a door of solidified energy which the scientists casually referred to as the TIR. Finch's true narrative began during the primary phase transition event, recorded 6 months into his deployment. The atmosphere in Sublevel 7 changed almost instantaneously. The temperature plummeted to near zero, and the low, mechanical hum of the facility was replaced by a high-pitched, resonant whine that felt like chewing glass. The scientists, a group I recognized from a defunct government research initiative, reacted with a mixture of terror and ecstatic anticipation. They weren't trying to contain the tear, they were trying to interact with it. The breach was sudden and catastrophic. The energy seal flared purple, then dissolved into what Finch described as liquid gravity. Through the opening came not fire or gas, but geometry that defied description, angles that hurt the eye, shadows that seemed brighter than the light. And then came the shards. Finch's description of the entities was painstaking, born of professional observation under extreme duress. They were not flesh and blood as we understand it. They were skeletal, but built from fractured, asymmetrical bone and cartilage that looked perpetually ripped. Their skin was translucent, stretched taut over internal organs that pulsed with unnatural, cold blue light. But their name derived from their primary weapon, the protrusion of hundreds of razor-sharp, crystalline shards erupting from their joints, backs, and even eyes, reflecting the fractured light of their origin dimension. They moved with a stuttering, non-Euclidean grace, occupying 3 points in space simultaneously, making them almost impossible to track. The shards were driven by an incomprehensible hunger, not for organic life, but for the fundamental integrity of matter. When they touched the containment walls, the concrete didn't crumble, it ceased to be concrete, devolving instantly into its constituent elements. When they touched a man, the man didn't bleed, he dissolved into a cloud of steam and fundamental particles, leaving behind only the metallic residue of blood cells. Finch was tasked with securing the primary research team for extraction. It was during this brutal, short-lived defense that he encountered the facility's chief bioengineer, Dr. Elias Vance. The name hit me like a physical shock. Elias Vance. The same name as the caving expert in Ashcroft. Was this a common name, or was this a signal? A recurring player in the maintenance of Project Chronos? The Dr. Vance in Blackwood Hills was pale, frantic, and oddly possessive of a sealed vial of metallic dust. He wasn't a sacrifice, he was a participant. They need the structure. Dr. Vance had hissed to Finch, his voice tight with fear and zealotry. The shards are attracted to entropy. They are the debt collectors of existence. If we let them consume too much, the system crashes. The ensuing escape was a massacre. Finch and his small tech-fit team, armed with specialized kinetic rounds, managed to herd Dr. Vance and a handful of physicists towards the extraction shaft. They were hunted relentlessly. Finch noted the shards didn't use sound, they communicated through a silent, deep-seated pressure in the skull that felt like being squeezed through a straw. His team members died protecting the narrow corridors, their bodies dissolving before they hit the ground. The pivotal moment came when they reached the elevator shaft. Dr. Vance, suddenly calm, turned to Finch. "We have what we came for," he said, gesturing to the vial. "Thank you for the diversion." He then activated a specialized EMP, designed to disable all non-essential equipment, which included Finch's communication array and the hydraulic clamp on the elevator door. Finch found himself trapped alone on sublevel 5, hearing the sickening, silent shhhhk of the shards ascending the shafts. He survived by deploying a Class 4 thermal shield and forcing himself through a ventilation duct meant for maintenance drones, leaving the facility to implode behind him. He didn't escape to freedom, he escaped to paperwork. The final pages of Dossier IV were an exercise in bitter irony. Arthur Finch emerged 3 days later, frostbitten and borderline insane, near the Blackwood Hills military perimeter. He was immediately detained, interrogated for 72 hours, and released with an official reprimand for gross mismanagement of classified equipment and unauthorized entry into restricted airspace. The incident report claimed the explosion was caused by a massive and unpreventable short circuit in the experimental plasma reactor. Finch was given a new identity, a minimal pension, and a lifelong mandate of silence, enforced by administrative threats. He was deemed a loose end, a glitch in the matrix, but not a threat to the system. I stared at the screen, absorbing the cold horror. Ashcroft provided the organic, physical threat, the maw, necessitating sacrifice. Blackwood Hills provided the dimensional threat, the shards, necessitating containment and calculated betrayal. The recurring name, Elias Vance, one the doomed, one the betrayer, was the linchpin. Project Chronos wasn't about studying the strange, it was about leveraging it. But leveraging it for what? The next file, Dossier IV, promised an answer, shifting the focus from physical containment to the highest form of human currency, ambition and moral corruption. Dossier III, originating from an anonymous source codenamed Julian Thorne, was not a technical report or a security log. It was a confessional diary, meticulously detailed, charting the slow, deliberate erosion of a soul. Thorne was a former intelligence procurement specialist obsessed with one thing: eradicating the physical ailment that was consuming him, a rare, debilitating genetic disorder that had made his existence a daily exercise in exquisite pain. His desperation made him the perfect target for the next layer of Project Chronos. The narrative began with Rain Calloway, a woman introduced in Thorne's diary as the conduit. Calloway operated within the highest echelons of global intelligence, facilitating discreet exchanges of information deemed too politically explosive for official channels. She offered Thorne not a cure, but perfection. She led him to the Society of the Grotesque, or as they were known internally, the Endowment. Their leader was Mr. Silas Garland, the man Thorne called the Curator. Garland's estate, situated in an unnamed, geographically isolated mansion that seemed to exist outside the usual mapping systems, was a place of impossible tranquility. Thorne described the halls as smelling of sandalwood and fresh snow. Garland himself was a picture of immaculate, terrifying health, smooth-skinned and ancient-eyed. The Curator's proposition was simple and purely Faustian: trade secrets, the unvarnished truth of global power movements, the weakness of governments, the real locations of the Ashcroft and Blackwood Hills projects, in exchange for the restructuring of his physical reality. Thorne, racked by pain, agreed instantly. The treatment, however, was not medical. It was an arcane, unsettling ritual performed in a subterranean chamber beneath Garland's mansion. Thorne described the experience not as surgery, but as retuning. Garland and his acolytes, wearing robes of heavy, dark velvet, performed incantations in a language that sounded like tectonic plates shifting. They used no instruments, only focused light and sound. The effect was instantaneous and sublime. The debilitating pain vanished. Thorne's twisted joints straightened. His failing organs regenerated. He felt not just healthy, but optimized, a human machine running at peak, supernatural efficiency. He felt the world with a clarity that was overwhelming. Colors were sharper, sounds richer, thought processes instantaneous. He had achieved biological immortality through an unnerving pact. For 3 years, Thorne was Garland's most prized asset, providing a steady stream of pure, actionable intelligence that allowed the Endowment, the Society of the Grotesque, to manipulate markets, elections, and even military movements from the shadows. He reveled in his perfected state, his agony replaced by a sterile, cold competency. But Thorne soon realized the true nature of the grotesque. The society was not charitable. It was a mechanism of control, and perfection came with a terrible, irreversible price tag. The process of healing was reversible, and worse. Thorne witnessed the tranquilizing of members who had failed to provide sufficient quality intelligence, or who had attempted to break the chain of command. Garland, with the same serene focus he used to heal Thorne, would initiate the unwinding. Thorne described the horrors of watching a perfect body decay in minutes, not into death, but into a permanent state of agonizing, grotesque deformity. The victims, the grotesque, became living statues of their deepest fears and pain. One man, who had suffered from intense social anxiety before his healing, was unwound into a shambling, hairless mass whose skin peeled away perpetually, revealing raw, screaming muscle tissue. These individuals were not killed, they were kept alive, housed in the catacombs beneath the mansion, perpetually writhing monuments to the Curator's power. They served as living pressure gauges, their collective agony fueling the strange energy source that Garland used for his manipulations. The perfection Thorne possessed was alone, backed by the collateral of his eternal suffering. The inevitable arrived when Thorne's source access was compromised, and the flow of high-grade intel dried up. Garland summoned him, not in anger, but in disappointed clinical detachment. "Julian," Garland had said, his voice a silken hum, "the system requires input. Your contribution is necessary. If the input stops, the output must be adjusted." Thorne knew what was coming. He tried to fight, but his optimized body was instantly betrayed by the very force that maintained it. Garland didn't need to touch him. He simply reversed the focus. Thorne felt the agonizing pain of his original genetic disorder return, not at its previous intensity, but amplified tenfold, filtered through a nervous system that had been supernaturally enhanced. It was like feeling the disease not in his bones, but in his atoms. His perfected skin began to slough off, his joints twisting into impossible angles. In his final entry, scrawled on encrypted paper before he became one of the grotesque, Thorne detailed his forced confession, the realization that Garland and the endowment were managing the fallout from Ashcroft and Blackwood Hills, not as external threats, but as controlled variables. They were trading information gained from these dimensional breaches for localized control over human society. The maw provided the necessary terror, the shards provided the necessary energy, and the grotesque provided the necessary intelligence stream. Thorne's last line before the code abruptly terminated was a desperate warning, asterisk. "The price of perfection is the debt of self. We are all paying." Asterisk. I closed the file, shaking off the chill of the curator's methodical cruelty. Ashcroft, sacrifice. Blackwood Hills, betrayal. Blackwood Hills, the endowment, moral corruption. The pieces were interlocking with terrifying precision, mapping a highly sophisticated systemic approach to cosmic horror. I realized that the entities I was reading about, the maw, the shards, were not random threats. They were nodes in a vast, global equation. The final dossier, Everbrook, promised the overarching context, the theological justification for the system, focusing on the concept of debt that Julian Thorne had referenced in his final moments. Everbrook was different. It wasn't a hidden facility or a deep sewer. It was a ghost town, perpetually shrouded in an unnatural, dense gray fog that the local authorities dismissed as persistent microclimate inversion. Dossier IV was the psychological profile and physical examination report of Marcus Bellwether, the only known survivor of the Everbrook event 5 years prior. This dossier documented not a single breach, but a total, existential collapse. Marcus Bellwether's file detailed a quiet, rural town swallowed entirely by the phenomenon. The fog was the key. It wasn't simple moisture. It carried a strange, heavy static charge and smelled faintly of ozone and dead leaves. Within weeks of the fog settling, the residents of Everbrook began to display symptoms of profound, rapid depletion. They didn't fall ill, they simply faded. Their vitality drained away, leaving behind hollow, quiet shells. Life was being revoked. Marcus, a local schoolteacher, was the anomaly. He was the only one who didn't fade. In fact, he seemed to thrive, growing unnaturally robust, his eyes clear and hyper-aware. But this vitality came at a catastrophic cost. As the town faded, Marcus realized he was becoming a siphon. Wherever he stayed, life retreated. Plants withered overnight, their leaves turning to brittle ash. The family dog, a loyal Labrador, deteriorated into a skeleton in 3 days after Marcus touched it. His wife, Sarah, tried to hide the rapid onset of her decay, her skin turning translucent, her laughter becoming a thin, rattling echo. The most chilling aspect of Marcus's survival was the internal realization: he wasn't just surviving, he was collecting. He felt the life force of Everbrook, the collective vitality of its residents, being funneled into him, a dense, sickening energy that burned behind his ribs. He was alive because the town was dying for him. Driven mad by guilt and the knowledge that he was directly responsible for the systematic erasure of his home, Marcus fled the town, seeking an explanation for his horrific existence. His journey, documented through intercepted communications and fragmented physical reports, led him not to a scientist or a government agent, but to a hidden entity within the surrounding ancient forest, known locally as the Oracle of the Mists. The Oracle's existence was only briefly noted in the official Project Chronos appendices as a biosensitive communications node. When Marcus finally located the Oracle, a massive, petrified tree stump surrounded by pools of shimmering black water, he was given the ultimate, horrifying revelation. The oracle spoke to him not in words, but in a torrent of shared memory and agonizing cosmic truth, revealing the true function of Project Chronos and the nature of the pervasive fog. You exist, the oracle communicated telepathically, because of a transaction. Life, as you know it, is an investment, a sustained anomaly in the natural state of chaos. The price for this coherence, this stable reality, is constant payment. Every structured system, society, physics, consciousness, accrues a deficit. This is the debt of existence. The fog over Everbrook was a localized manifestation of the debt being called in. The town had been secretly selected, perhaps based on the weak genetic lineage identified by the Curator's intelligence network, as the designated payment zone. Marcus was not lucky. He was the designated vessel, the conduit through which the collected vitality would be processed before being returned to the system balance. The oracle explained that the maw in Ashcroft and the shards in Blackwood Hills were merely different methods of debt collection, different frequencies of cosmic entropy used to stabilize the larger, fragile reality. The maw consumed the physical, the shards consumed the dimensional integrity, and Everbrook was consuming the pure, vital essence of life. Marcus understood then that his continued existence was a catastrophic anomaly. He had to pay the debt he had been forced to collect. The oracle provided him with the means, a simple, obsidian vial filled with a thick, viscous liquid that smelled like ozone and crushed bone, the concentrated life debt of Everbrook. The final report was a police deposition from a distant, skeptical detective who found Marcus wandering near the highway. Marcus was physically perfect but catatonic, gripping a shattered vial. The records indicate he had drunk the liquid. The process was documented by external thermal imaging captured by a Chronos monitoring drone. When Marcus consumed the debt, the concentrated life force turned inward. He didn't explode or dissolve. He experienced an instantaneous, comprehensive reversal of every single collected life force. The thermal images showed him burning internally with cold, blue light, his body rapidly deteriorating, paying back the collected vitality in a terrifying fraction of a second. Marcus Bellwether did not survive the debt payment. But the official report concluded. Following the subject's demise, the persistent microclimate inversion over Everbrook rapidly dissipated. Vegetation growth resumed at an abnormally accelerated rate. Ecological balance restored. Balance restored. The recurring theme was not death, but equilibrium enforced through horrific violence. I had seen the sacrifice, Ashcroft, the betrayal, Blackwood Hills, the corruption, the Curator, and the theological justification, Everbrook. Project Chronos was not a research project. It was an accounting firm, managing humanity's cosmological mortgage. I sat back in my chair, the screen reflecting my face, pale, sweat-slicked, the face of a man who had just synthesized the ultimate truth. Reality is a commodity, and something ancient and terrifying is demanding payment. The 4 dossiers coalesced in my mind, forming a unified, self-sustaining structure. The chthonic maw harvested physical entropy and biological material beneath Ashcroft. The shards, operating from the dimensional breach at Blackwood Hills, Ivory cage, harvested spatial integrity and exotic energy. The Society of the Grotesque, the Curator, harvested intelligence and moral degradation, fueling their manipulative network and securing human assets. And finally, Everbrook revealed the principle of the debt of existence, demonstrating the necessity of periodic, systemic erasure to maintain stability. Elias Vance, the plumber, and Dr. Elias Vance, the scientist, were symbolic bookends, the necessary pawn and the necessary betrayer, confirming that Chronos operated on all levels. I, the Archivist, had not merely solved a cipher, I had mapped the operational framework of the cosmic bureaucracy. The thrill of synthesis quickly turned to cold dread. In my focus on the pattern, I had forgotten the most fundamental rule of classified intelligence. When you see the whole picture, you become part of the picture. I had violated the system's sanctity. My access logs, my encrypted drive, the very heat signature of my office, all had been compromised the moment I broke the final encryption layer on the Everbrook file. The light fixture above me flickered once, harshly, then died. My monitors, which had been displaying the vibrant horror of the dossiers, snapped to a uniform, absolute black. The air conditioning unit, which usually maintained the precise 68-degree chill required for server operation, abruptly choked and went silent. Then, the metallic clack of the security system engaging. The steel blast door to my office, designed to open only with Retina and Voice ID, sealed with an audible, heavy thud. I was locked in. My own secure tomb. I reached for my communication device, an encrypted satellite phone designed to pierce any electromagnetic interference. The screen displayed only static, interspersed with rhythmic, high-frequency spikes. The communication was jammed, or perhaps, preempted. A smell began to filter through the ventilation ducts, a heavy, sickly sweet odor that instantly caused my sinuses to burn. It was the scent described by Elias Vance in Ashcroft, deep beneath the surface, damp earth, methane gas, and that raw, metallic tang of clay and sulfuric decay. The smell of the maw. I scrambled back from my desk, heart hammering against my ribs, realizing the immediate, horrifying implication: the system was not external. It did not send agents in suits. It sent its collectors. A vibration started. It was subtle at first, a low-frequency hum that made the water bottle on my desk ripple slightly. Then it intensified, mirroring the description of the phenomenon beneath Ashcroft. Thump, thump, heavy and slow, resonating through the concrete floor beneath my feet. It was far too powerful to be the building's foundation settling. It was too vast for the structure to contain. The thump, thump, grew louder, moving with deliberate, dreadful speed toward my location. It wasn't coming from the ground level. It was coming from the sub-basement, the infrastructure tunnels that housed the deepest utility lines, the hidden arteries of the building. The very veins of the city. The archivist, who had spent his life analyzing the screams of others, now felt his own fear materialize, cold and heavy in his stomach. He wasn't safe in the sterile tomb of glass. He was simply the next file. The rhythmic pounding stopped directly beneath me. A scraping sound, wet and immensely heavy, followed. SHHHHK, SHHHHK, the sound of something large, organic, and armed with immense, sharp claws testing the integrity of the concrete barrier separating me from the profound, demanding hunger below. I looked at the black monitors, the screen silently echoing Julian Thorne's last desperate warning: asterisk, the price of perfection is the debt of self. We are all paying, asterisk. And in the silence of my locked office, just before the first, fine crack spiderwebbed across the floor tiles, I understood that I was Project Chronos' final, necessary payment. The maw had come for the man who saw the system whole. The debt collector had arrived.